Hi, welcome to Meaning of Life TV. My name is Aryeh Cohen-Wade, and I'll be your host today for an episode with the author Michael Benson. Michael, could you introduce yourself?
Sure. Michael Benson. I'm a writer and a visual artist and a filmmaker.
And most important for this conversation, you are the author of the new book, Space Odyssey. It has a very shiny cover. You can see it's reflecting the light a little bit. Subtitle, Stanley Kubrick, Arthur C. Clarke, and the Making of a Masterpiece. It's a really enjoyable book. Thank you so much for coming on to discuss it. It is, I'd say this is like definitive, like everything you want to know about the filming of the movie 2001: A Space Odyssey is included here, and I learned a lot by reading it. Why don't we start by talking about what drew you to the topic to begin with?
By the way, before I do that, I'd like to say it wasn't intended to be definitive, but it sort of the project ran away with me, or perhaps the film ran away with me in the sense that I was discovering so much interesting material that the book got longer than the original intended length. Mm-hmm. Now, as for what drew me to the topic, I've been fascinated by 2001 since I was 6 years old, which is when my mom took me to see it in the year '68. It's a 50-year-old film now. I was just so staggered by that film. Of course, at age 6, your sensors are kind of wide open. Your senses. I was staggered by it. As I said, I was floored by it, and it was so intriguing to me. And then I saw it many times since then, and I always thought I should really revisit this and try to find out how they made it and so forth.
Mm-hmm. I remember my first encounter with it was through the book. I had read Childhood's End as like a pick your own book for a class assignment and write an essay about it kind of thing. And I remember liking that, and I was like, oh, let's try his next one, 2001. And so I was like 14, and I remember liking the book a lot more than the movie at that age, and thinking that the movie, left out a lot of stuff and wasn't as good. And then I went on, I read most of the sequels that Clarke wrote after that, but those are not quite as good. Okay, so why don't we start with talking about like who Kubrick and Clarke were and how they met in the mid '60s.
Sure. Well, so Kubrick had done a number of films, including Spartacus, which he did not really as the person in complete command of it. He had been hired by Kirk Douglas, who was the producer, to do this big budget Hollywood film. After that, he did Dr. Strangelove. Actually, he did Lolita and Dr. Strangelove, two black and white, relatively low budget films that were, that did very well. Especially Dr. Strangelove was a huge hit, Cold War satire, black humor infused Cold War satire. That put him, the combination of Spartacus, which showed that he could hold down a big budget Hollywood film, and it was hugely successful, lots of Oscars, big box office. That, plus the fact that he could do something like Strangelove, which was also commercially successful and critically successful. Those two projects, above all others, created conditions allowing MGM to greenlight a very ambitious, very expensive science fiction epic film. As for Clarke, as you mentioned, you had read Childhood's End. So he was a leading science fiction author of the golden age of science fiction. There was the so-called Big Three: Robert Heinlein, Arthur Clarke, and Isaac Asimov. He was obviously one of them. Apart from Childhood's End, he wrote many, many brilliant short stories, including one called The Sentinel, which they ended up basing 2001 partly on. And one thing about Arthur that is not as well remembered today is that he was also a leading proponent and advocate within nonfiction essays and books of human expansion off the Earth. So he really belongs in the history of the space age as well as the history of science fiction as a leading advocate, kind of propagandist in a good sense, for human expansion off the Earth.
Right, and isn't he credited with kind of coming up with the idea of geosynchronous satellite orbit or something like that?
He received some of the credit. Now, those ideas had been in circulation, but he synthesized them admirably in a piece he wrote and submitted to an obscure British journal called Wireless World in 1945, the year of the end of the Second World War. We knew about the V2, but he didn't think, the V2 rocket was the German rocket, Werner von Braun's vengeance weapon, which was used to bombard the Brits, basically, but also advancing Allied forces in Western Europe during the very end of the Second World War. So that rocket was powerful and clearly indicated that spaceflight was achievable with some more development. Clark, and also the idea of geostationary orbit had been out there. It had been, for example, in a series of short stories called Venus Prime. I forget the name of that author, but that was science fiction. The idea of having a geostationary communication satellite between Earth and Venus, interestingly enough, was out there. Clark synthesized a whole series of ideas and proposed in his Wireless World article in 1945 that geostationary space stations could be used for telecommunications. He said space stations because, as he explained to me, because I got to know Arthur, he said that he thought that somebody would have to be up there to change the vacuum tubes. This is pre-transistor, So, but in any case, he did synthesize these ideas in a very creative way, published that paper, suggested geostationary orbit as a great place for telecommunications, and as they say, the rest is history. It focused a lot of minds, and it pulled together, as I said, all these ideas. So yes, he does have a place in the history of technology, not just science fiction.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So the origin of the film seems to be that Kubrick wanted to make a serious science fiction film. Like there have been a couple, like The Day the Earth Stood Still, but most of them had been like B-movie, kind of cheap fare. And then he wanted to like make a serious, ambitious film, and then he sought out Clark to collaborate.
In his first, in his first letter to Clark, which was March 31st, 1964, my second birthday, as it happened, he proposed that they meet and discuss the possibility of doing the first good science fiction movie, the first truly good science fiction movie, in quotes. It was really about quality. He had in mind that the genre had been badly served by film. I have a quote in my book that he said to Tony Fruin, his assistant, cinema has let science fiction down. That was his observation. He thought that the first truly excellent science fiction movie was within his grasp, and that was the goal.
Mm-hmm. Can we talk a little bit more about their personalities? And sure. We can go forward in time a little bit. It's a sympathetic portrayal of both, but you show some of their warts along with them. Kubrick seems like, in some way, the ultimate perfectionist. Maybe megalomaniacal would be too much, but if he wants something, he's going to get it no matter what it takes. Clark he's older, he's more established in his career, and he has this kind of, he has a very serious side, but then he has this kind of semi-secret life, in what became known as Sri Lanka, where he was living as an expatriate, and one of his main concerns is that he's running out of money because of his profligate associates.
Well, his profligate boyfriend, basically Mike Wilson, was spending all of his money. Everything Arthur earned for almost 20 years went into Mike Wilson's projects. And now they put that under the umbrella of Clark Wilson Associates, which was their joint project, which was making films, interestingly enough, in Sri Lanka. So before Kubrick contacted Clark, Clark had already produced several films that Mike Wilson directed. He was in film, but he was in film on a local level in Ceylon, which is what Sri Lanka used to be called. So and then everything he earned, as I said, went to those projects, and so there was a financial strain on him throughout the production of 2001. Now, both of them were brilliant guys, and as I said in my book, really, their meeting was a perfect meeting of content meeting ability in a certain way, and vice versa. So Kubrick knew how to make films. He was at the top of his game as a filmmaker, and he didn't necessarily have command of some of the ideas that Clarke had been working on for decades, concerning the ultimate fate of the human species, the trajectory from pre-human primate to kind of post-human, which is, by the way, in in Childhood's End, the meaning of that title is that, the human race is shepherded in a way by this alien species through this evolutionary path, which leads to the arrival of a post-human species. Very Nietzschean concept. So these were concepts that Clarke was working with. So that was a perfect match in a way. You had all these ideas, Clarke's ideas, meeting the ability to translate them to film. And so their discussions were intense, lengthy. They would go on for 8-10 hours. They would walk all over Manhattan. They first met in April '64 in New York City, spent about a year and change in the city discussing how to make this film. I think very meaningful for both of them. They both acknowledged each other later. There were tensions sometimes between them, but there were tensions during production. There were tensions after, but there was definitely a kind of mutual admiration society going on there between those guys.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you make the case convincingly that this is like one of the great creative partnerships of the last century.
Definitely.
So you spent a lot of time even before. I think you don't reach the production chapter until about page 150. Like there's a lot of stuff that happens before they actually get to start shooting. You describe a little bit of that period of pre-production and conceptualization.
Yeah, well, I mean, film is pre-production, production, and post. In the traditional film. But with 2001, you had pre-production of several phases, really. And then you had production, which was nominally the shooting with the actors, live action shooting with Keir Dullea and Gary Lockwood playing Bowman and Poole, the two astronauts on the spacecraft heading for Jupiter. But then you had, and so that was live action production. But so then they went into post, which normally would be editing together what was cut, mixing sound, and releasing it. But this was a highly ambitious science fiction film where they were developing all the effects as they went, and it was all analog effects, not digital. So they had to basically create techniques, that had never been made before, and at a level of realism that was demanded. As you said, Kubrick was a perfectionist. He was not going to settle for something that was not utterly believable. Everybody understood that. He had the budget to do that, to achieve that, using traditional photographic means, meaning no CGI. We're way before CGI. But there was another thing. The spacewalk scenes had to be shot with the stuntman in a studio. That was all live action too. And then also that whole the Dawn of Man sequence, which starts the film, 20 minutes of two tribes of man apes, Australopithecus africanus, facing off against each other at the water hole, and then one of them, the arrival of the monolith, and then one of them intuits how to use a heavy thigh bone as a weapon. That whole sequence had also not been solved. There were multiple attempts to create believable costumes that people would not see as human beings stuffed into ape suits. And I document all that in the book. That was also not finished when they finished live action production at the end of towards the end of '66. So all that still had to be done. So actually, it's more like a 4-part structure: pre-production, production, and then live action, post-production, and then finally editing, mixing, and releasing.
Mm-hmm.
Big project.
So one of the conflicts between Clarke and Kubrick is they decided early on to produce a novelization, although that word is a little inaccurate because that more implies like you're looking at the finished movie and then writing a book about it. This is like
right.
They took the script, I guess they kind of created the novel draft first and then turned that into the script. So then that was what Clarke was mainly working on. And as the film was getting into production, Clark wanted to sign a contract with a book publisher, and Kubrick was kind of stringing him along for
Right.
a long time with before signing off on it. And yeah, so that's that was my first encounter with it, and there are differences. It's very unusual. Like I don't know of another case where you had a book being produced of a movie like contemporaneously from an original idea, and then
Yes.
it's just like a very unusual process.
Well, I think that Kubrick correctly understood that Clark had never written a script, and that scripts are very clumsy, cumbersome ways of exploring ideas. You know, what you really want to do is to be able to comfortably explore ideas and then develop a script based on what you've developed. And so he proposed to Clark, who was greatly relieved to hear this idea, that they do a novel first and develop a script after that. Because Clark knew how to write novels, he didn't know how to write scripts. Okay, so then they worked on a novel draft, and they went out. I mean, there were so many pages written that weren't in that final novel you read, which you incorrectly, I would argue, allege is better than the film.
Yeah, I wonder. As a 14-year-old, it was more appealing to me. If I went back to it 20 years later, I'm sure I would have a different opinion of it.
Anyway, I probably shouldn't be so. That's my opinion, and everybody has their own opinion. Anyway, I do like the novel. I think it's good, and I think it's useful to read the novel if you're mystified by the film, because you see what they were getting at. Because this being a prose being a medium where you really have to sort of explain yourself, and film being a medium where you can get away with being very opaque, to simplify crudely.
Mm-hmm.
One helps the other. Where were we actually? We were talking about them cooking up the novel before the film. And then, it's actually too simple to say, well, they wrote the novel and then they developed a script out of it, because they were developing that script. They were modifying that script every day during production. And when I say they, I actually mean Kubrick and his. Though Arthur was also, fully in the loop and exploring options and discussing with Kubrick throughout. So they modified it as they shot it. One reason they couldn't release the book, one of two major reasons why Clark couldn't release the book before the film came out, was that he didn't know what Kubrick would be doing next, and he didn't want the book to be totally different, from the film. And the second was that Kubrick had very cannily built into his agreement with Clark that he would have to okay the publication of the book, and Kubrick incautiously had said that they would publish the novel first and then out would come the film. Clark took him at his word. Kubrick had second thoughts about that, didn't want the story to be out there before the film, and essentially strung Arthur along until the film was out, and then the novel came out. And by the way, even though Clark was extremely nervous and upset and even contemplating a lawsuit against Kubrick, which is something I managed to drill down into the archives enough to determine, which hasn't really been out there before. Despite all that, he ended up not pursuing that. But despite all that, he did, in the end, have this huge success with the novel. So at one point, Kubrick said to him, when Clark was really frantically arguing that let's release the novel now, he said, it's never as bad as it seems. I'm convinced everything will turn out all right in the end, Arthur. And it did for Arthur, because he became truly world famous. The novel sold in huge quantities, big bestseller. He made tons of money, Arthur, and he was much more famous than Heinlein and Asimov at the end of the story. Mm-hmm. Which is probably something that in his heart of hearts he was kind of interested in having happen. So
you note that that Kubrick was very like a canny operator, and you have some stuff about how he would negotiate with suppliers and always going for the absolute lowest price. So he wasn't just like an artistic genius. He had this like very practical side about how to like get what he wanted.
Yeah, he was producing the film. Now, he had all these multiple hats. He was also basically the cameraman. He shot half of the film himself. He was on camera half the time. That guy was as hands-on as they get, Kubrick. But he was producing, and he was very aware, because it would be easy to say, well, he was just cheap. Well, no. I mean, he wanted all the money he got to be visible on the screen. He didn't. The reason that he hired actors who were not big budget actors, is he could pay them less, and he knew they were good. But that means the budget could go to what you saw on the screen. He didn't know how much the visual effects would cost. So he was very canny, and he did talk everybody down, and he was, he would stick to his guns too. He had, there's a line from Michael Hare about the north face of Stanley's resolve, the sheer north face of Stanley's resolve. When that guy decided something, he was not going to back down. When he was really firm on something, he was as firm as granite.
Yeah.
So.
Let's talk a little bit about the Dawn of Man sequence, which
Sure.
opens the movie. Can you? So the development of that is pretty amazing, and what they were able to achieve through the makeup and the prosthetics is pretty remarkable. Can you detail some of that process?
Yeah, no, that is almost like that could be a separate book, this epic struggle to produce these believable man-apes for Stanley Kubrick between Stuart Freeborn, the makeup genius. I mean, I have no hesitation in calling that guy a genius. What he pulled out of the hat when it came to costumes for the man-ape sequence, the Dawn of Man sequence, was absolutely incredible. And I detailed it in, I had the benefit of getting interviews conducted with Stuart Freeborn before he died. I mean, obviously before he died, but he died a long time ago. He died in, I think it was the early noughts, and I didn't have a chance to talk to him. But I benefited from interviews that had been conducted with him, including by Cinefex magazine, and Don Shea is the guy publisher of Cinefex, and he sent me these unedited transcripts of Freeborn. And Freeborn was working with Dan Richter, an American mime, who came on in the middle of the struggle to try to figure out how to realize the Dawn of Man sequence. So Freeborn had already done several types of costumes, which Kubrick shot down, each one, First he did man-ape suits. Kubrick shot it down as looking too artificial. Then he did Neanderthals, which are later in the timeline of human evolution, and therefore are basically shaggy but basically naked proto-humans. But then there was the problem of genitalia, seeing the genitalia on the screen. So then they had to go back to the man-apes. Okay. So then finally, and they didn't know if they were going to shoot in Africa or in the deserts of Spain or on location, or were they going to try it in the studio? And that's another whole thing, where they did front projection. They sent a team to Southwest Africa, to Namibia, to photograph desert landscapes, which were seamlessly incorporated into sets built at MGM Boreham Wood, north of London. Because the film was shot, the film was produced just north of London in Boreham Wood.
I rewatched the movie yesterday in preparation for this, and it's astonishing that none of that was filmed on location. It was all this front projection technique and sets.
And it's totally believable.
Yeah.
Yeah. So Stuart Freeborn, I should say, what Dan Richter brought to the conversation was this kind of intuitive genius, another genius. These are two geniuses, really, Freeborn and Richter. Richter had studied animals his whole life, been very interested in animal movement. He quickly established how he studied apes in the London Zoo, including the gorilla, the most famous gorilla in British history, in UK history, which is this huge animal that was there for 20 years, something in the zoo, and determined how to recreate large ape, upper body movements. So it was a chest first way of moving, but then there was a problem with what to do with these big human legs, which are hard to disguise and make look like they're, from an earlier species. And then Kubrick in his own high intelligence, gave Richter a 16 millimeter film camera, made sure he learned how to use it, and sent him off to the monkey house in the London Zoo to film apes. And also, that he learned how to film in slow motion. So at one point, when he realized he wasn't learning anything more about about simian body movements from the great apes and the gorilla, he went to look at the gibbons. an Asian, ape species, which, typically swings on vines in the jungle, but also runs down to the jungle floor and runs across the jungle floor, right? And he filmed some gibbons in slow motion running across the floor of their, big cage in London, and realized that they had this type of body, motion as they ran, which he could borrow from for the lower body motions of his man apes. And this is probably too much information, but the entire story of how they put that man ape, the Dawn of Man sequence together, it really, as I said, it could be a separate book almost. It was so interesting, and there was so much commitment to accuracy. They studied Louis Leakey's work. They studied Jane Goodall, the films made of Jane Goodall working with apes, man apes. They were very influenced by the paleoanthropological research done up until that period. They read the scientific papers. This was really science fiction at its finest in a way, because science fiction, hard science fiction, is about not violating what we've learned from science, and then using that to project. And you can project forward into the future, or you can project back into the past with it. And this was a brilliant example of the latter.
Mm-hmm. Let's talk a little bit about HAL 9000. And this also relates to a piece that you published in the New York Times a couple weeks ago called "What 2001 Got Right."
Yes.
Where did this idea come from to have this super intelligent computer kind of be one of the main characters?
Well, that evolved like many things in the film, not just the shooting, in the pre-production, production, post. It evolved. So the original idea was to have a kind of robot, not particularly intelligent robot, kind of clumsily walking around the spaceship. That is in some ways in debt to Asimov, his iRobot series of books. That became a mainframe computer called Athena. Athena being the goddess who helped Odysseus out of many a tight spot, in the Odyssey. And her role was indeterminate. Her intelligence level wasn't clear. It wasn't clear. Then Athena gradually became HAL as the team, both Kubrick and Clarke and their people, Roger Karras, some other people, were interfacing with leading American and also British technology firms. So Kubrick himself connected with Marvin Minsky, co-founder of MIT's Artificial Intelligence Lab, and had intensive consultations with him about where our AI might be in the year 2001. And then they also had input from IBM, and the design bureau of IBM, which I say in my book is, comparable in its cultural, weight to the Apple design bureau today. And it was run by Elliot Noyce, he's a very famous designer. He designed the Selectric typewriter, but he also designed the IBM logo. And Noyce and his group suggested to Kubrick that a computer of that level of sophistication in the year 2001 might be a computer that you go inside of. You can go into the brain of effectively, rather than a computer that you're always outside of and then interfacing with in that way.
Right, and that's the image that appears on the cover of the book, is
yes.
inside the brain room.
That's right. And Kubrick was having a bad day that day when he got this letter suggesting this, and he said, this is completely useless. This is a total waste of time. I think we're just wasting time with these people, IBM. Why didn't they tell us how we can interface with the computer? He lost his cool a little bit. Fairly rare for him. And then he obviously thought it over the weekend. And there were drawings, by the way, in the proposal from IBM of these guys floating in a brain room of a computer. And he obviously thought it over, probably talked to Clarke about it, and they realized there are dramatic possibilities there, in having a human being in the brain of the computer. And then that gradually developed as they discussed, ways of upping the drama during the trip to Jupiter. Hal became more and more irrational, and then in the end, Hal, of course, if you've seen the film, kills off the whole entire crew except for Bowman, producing this spike in drama, and then that fantastic scene, where Bowman deprograms Hal. Stop, Dave. I can feel it. My mind is going. That scene. That developed after a lot of backstory.
Yeah, so let's talk a little bit about the piece you wrote for the Times. How do you see this prediction from 50 years ago of what artificial intelligence would be lining up with how technology has actually advanced?
Well, clearly AI is a front burner issue now. I mean, especially now with Cambridge Analytica and, some of these allegations about AI being deployed for manipulation, purposes of manipulation. Now, I think actually when it comes to Cambridge Analytica, they probably didn't have that much AI expertise, but you can see it's coming, and the Chinese are developing AI with facial recognition algorithms and so forth, as they try to, keep a lid on their 1.5 billion population. So there are reasons to be really worried about AI. How that connects to Hal? I mean, Hal is a logical cautionary tale 50 years later. He runs amok, kills off the crew, has to be deprogrammed forcibly. But interestingly, late in the story of my writing this book, I stumbled on an archived, actually at archive.org, it's a fantastic site. It archives all kinds of material. I stumbled on an archived radio interview from a San Francisco radio station in April '68, which was the month 2001 came out. And it was an interview between Arthur Clarke and a San Francisco radio station. And the interviewer said, "Do you think we're being dehumanized by technology?" And Clarke said, without skipping a beat, he said, "I think we're being superhumanized by it." I see a cat in the frame.
Yeah, she enjoys
a black cat driving in the frame.
Yeah, she enjoys making cameo appearances during these recordings.
He said, "I think it's superhumanizing us." And then he said something quite interesting. He said, everybody is entitled to their own opinion about 2001, and none of them are wrong. But he said, in his view, Bowman's victory over Hal could prove to be a Pyrrhic victory. And I thought that was, typically smart and provocative and thought-provoking. And I think he's probably right. It is, as you know, there are a lot of people out there warning about what might happen when AI becomes self-improving. And speaking of cats, I think it was Elon Musk who said we might end up being house cats, lounging around as the AI does. The AI does his thing or its thing. So.
Well, yeah, the use of that specific word, superhuman, gets us back to the Nietzsche quote of,
yes.
Of humanity becoming the Übermensch. And we're transitioning towards the end of the film, in which humanity seems to evolve into another plane. But I had never thought before that, maybe the Übermensch is the thing we created, the artificial intelligence.
Yeah, exactly. By the way, Übermensch literally translated means beyond man. Doesn't mean Superman. It means beyond man. And yeah, I think that's right. I think that what Clarke was doing there is presenting an alternative ending, an alternative way of looking at the story. In the actual story, it's a human astronaut that's reborn, becomes this star child, which is kind of in keeping also with Childhood's End. And by the way, I argue in the book that the father of this image story and text story of the book is a Russian spaceflight theorist and scientist named Konstantin Tsiolkovsky, who's widely credited as being the father of spaceflight. And he wrote in the early 20th century, "Earth is the cradle of the mind, but humanity cannot remain in its cradle forever." And that's a kind of epic pronouncement that led to, arguably, paved the way for actual spaceflight and Yuri Gagarin and Neil Armstrong on the moon and so forth. It's the programmatic utopian pronouncement. We must grow out of our cradle. And Childhood's End, by the way, the title Childhood's End makes an oblique reference to Tsiolkovsky's pronouncement. And the star child at the end of 2001 is a literalization of that idea of leaving the cradle, But you're right. I mean, it is also possible, and I had a chance to talk with Arthur about some of these ideas myself. It's also quite possible that we are simply going to be superseded by a descendant, a species that follows us that is actually more machine than organic, more machine than biological.
So let's talk about the ending. So Bowman pilots one of the pods into the floating monolith, and this is when it kind of all goes crazy. Can you talk about how they developed this idea, and then how they practically implemented the special effects?
Well, yeah, that is actually one place where the visual effects really become, they're at their most innovative. The Stargate sequence, which is what we're talking about, Stargate being this wormhole to other spaces and times in the universe, originated in Kubrick's fascination with a CBC documentary, Canadian Broadcast Company, documentary called Universe, which came out in, I think it was 60 or 61, and it was black and white. But the visual effects people behind it, led by a guy named Wally Gentleman, worked out a way, again, we're way pre-CGI. Everything is analog. Everything has to be filmed with lenses in real time and so forth. They figured out a way to use tanks of paint thinner into which they dropped paints and inks, and filmed this with a macro lens at a high frame rate to make slow motion the effect of nebulae opening in space, nebulae blossoming in space, and star clusters expanding and galaxies morphing and so on. So they did this in an analog fashion in black and white in that film. Kubrick was really excited by it because he'd watched many, many, many movies with really cheesy visual effects. This was done with a hell of a lot more sophistication. And he hired Wally Gentleman, but he himself, before hiring Wally, who only lasted on the film a year and a half because they had personality conflicts, before any of that, Kubrick rented an abandoned brassiere factory in the Upper West Side of Manhattan and used it to film visual effects now in color using inks and paints in paint thinner at a high frame rate, just as I said. That was and that material, a good part of it, probably a small part of it when you consider how much he shot, but a good part of the Stargate sequence, about 1/3, is that material that Kubrick himself shot in New York City in 1965. But then he thought, well, later on when they were in London and working on the film and in post-production, he challenged his visual effects people to come up with other ideas that could augment it. And so you have Doug Trumbull innovating and expanding on a technique called slit scan that had already been developed in LA by George Whitney, a visual effects pioneer, and introducing this kind of hurtling forward motion using the slit scan technique, which resulted in those corridors of light, scintillating light, and this sense of vaulting through space and time. That was Doug Trumbull's great innovation. And then there were other techniques used in there.
And then, so I remember when I first saw this movie, what happens after the Stargate sequence was when I was like, what the hell is going on here? He ends up in his pod ends up in a French hotel room, and then he quickly ages, and then he is seemingly reborn and returns to Earth as this Star Child. How did they? Do you know where this idea came from, and why did they choose a French hotel room as opposed to something else?
I can tell you. Well, the idea originated in Arthur and Stanley in their collaboration in New York City in 1965, where they knew that there would be some kind of trip sequence. They didn't call it that necessarily, but this indoctrination in a way into the mysteries of deep space by the aliens, invisible aliens, as they brought the astronaut into this, through this Stargate. And then the question, so I'm pretty sure it was Clark who came up with this idea of that at the end of all that, the aliens would provide a room to the astronaut so he could kind of have some security and recover from the effects, the impact psychologically of seeing all of this. So that was in an early written draft of the novel in 1965, that there'd be a room. Okay, so then the question is, what kind of room? as they went into production. And they did approach an American company that did floorings, because there were all these corporate collaborations in 2001, IBM, et cetera, et cetera. So they approached Armstrong Cork Company, which proposed a very futuristic kind of room. And for a while, it looked like they might be going with that, but then it became clear that there might be some confusion on the part of the audience that that this was a room that the aliens live in, and the astronauts stumbled into an alien environment. So finally, Tony Masters, the production designer, said to Stanley, "Listen, why don't we just do a French period room? We can do that really well here." And I think that would be very effective. And then Kubrick thought about it, and he said, "Yeah, let's do that." But by the way, just one last little footnote there. He had proposed in a draft of the script. Kubrick had the idea of a Victorian room, so it simply changed periods, And the idea was that it was a room seen on a TV signal from Earth that the aliens decided, okay, well, he'll probably be comfortable in this kind of environment because we see it in a TV program. The TV program never made it into the film, but the room did.
And that shows. Kubrick was both intensely focused on his vision, but he was also very open to suggestion from his collaborators.
Yes.
So. Let's skip over post-production and go to the release of the film. And the way you describe it, the initial premiere of the movie was kind of a disaster.
It was a disaster. It was an utter disaster in the sense that the reviews were all negative. A lot of the audience left. We're talking about April 3rd, 1968, at the Loew's Capitol Theater on Broadway, just north of Times Square. It was an invitation-only crowd of, entertainment world luminaries, MGM executives, people with the clout to get tickets. They were mostly older people. Christiane Kubrick sketched the scene for me, the widow, Christiane being Stanley's widow, and said when she looked around as the lights were going down, she said to herself, "A lot of alte Kakers here." Christiane is being German, and alte Kakers being a phrase that's common to both Yiddish and German, basically meaning old farts. Okay. And, and then people didn't get it. They were walking out. In fact, I also I spoke to a guy named James Randi, a.k.a. the Magnificent Randy. Mm-hmm. And he was a magician and escape artist. And he came to that screening with a posse of science fiction writers that included Isaac Asimov. And he remembered a near audience revolt, before the intermission, where Kubrick showed one too many scenes of an astronaut exercising in this wheel-shaped centrifuge set. It's a fantastic set, there's a magical opening shot of the interior of the Discovery spacecraft where you see the astronaut running in circles, upside down, right side up, sideways, and so on. But Kubrick made the mistake of having that, and that was the opening shot is Gary Lockwood. And then Kubrick made the mistake. He was having too much fun with his toys, clearly. And he had another scene now with, Keir Dullea as Bowman running in a circle, exercising. And that's when the Magnificent Randy started sensing, and not just sensing, hearing audience discontent. People were saying, okay, next scene, and stuff like that. And there were even some hisses and so forth. And then I also, in the book, document, when the lights went up for the intermission, Randy was sitting right next to the aisle, at the bottom of which, towards the screen, towards the front of the theater, Kubrick and Clarke had been sitting. And he saw Kubrick and Clarke walking silently up the aisle during the intermission, with Kubrick lost in thought and tears of humiliation on Clarke's face. And Clarke left in the intermission along with a big percentage, some percentage of the audience. Mm-hmm. So it was a disaster. And then that night, Kubrick and the Kubricks had hosted a reception in a hotel in New York City. It was supposed to be a kind of victory lap, celebration, and it was more like a wake. And Kubrick was extremely upset, and at the end, when everybody had left, Christian told me that he was pacing the room and saying, "What am I going to do? They hated it. What am I going to do?" He was losing his voice from too much. He was chain smoking cigarettes, and the stress the stress of it caused him to lose his voice. And it looked like it was going to. And by the way, the MGM executives thought this is a potentially studio destroying disaster. Okay, we know it didn't turn out that way. It ended up, by the way, being the highest grossing film of 1968. And the next day, there was a line from the box office stretching down Broadway, and that line, metaphorically, never really disappeared because it was high attendance throughout the year, and it was predominantly younger people who went to see it. So it was your kind of prototypical late 60s, generation gap situation where the older people didn't get the film and the younger people did. But one last thing I would say about this. Kubrick did end up trimming 20 minutes from the film in the next few days after that disastrous premiere. He understood that there were places where, the audience was really squirming, which is the phrase used by Roger Karras, his VP. Kubrick's VP said, that Kubrick was pacing the theater during that premiere, assessing the squirm factor. Mm-hmm. So he trimmed 20 minutes, and then the critics who saw the trim version, it was almost uniformly positive. So there was definitely a change. There was a subtle but clear difference in reaction to not that subtle. I mean, for example, the Boston Globe's reviewer who saw the trim version said this film is as exciting as the discovery of a new dimension in life. Talk about a rave.
So do you think it was the edits, removing the 20 minutes that did it, or do you think it's just that the initial people didn't know what the hell they were in for and were confused by the film?
I think it was both. I think the edits were key. I think it probably would have been a success anyway because it's such a mind-blowing film, such an innovative piece of work. It's not unusual that you have a game-changing work of art coming out and there being initial incomprehension and negative assessments. It happened to James Joyce with Ulysses. It's happened. A radically innovative film can be dismissed at the beginning and misunderstood and even made fun of. But I do think that those trims were important. And I think, by the way, to jump all the way to the end of Kubrick's career, Eyes Wide Shut would have been received better, that's his last feature, if he had trimmed it, and he probably would have trimmed it if he hadn't died of a heart attack, having screened the, what was described as the release cut, the final cut, but which probably would have been trimmed further.
Mm-hmm. Parts. So he cut these parts of Keir Delay running around the spaceship and other parts that weren't necessary for the understanding of the plot. There's a sense of almost like he wants to have some level of boredom in the film. Like there's long shots that are, the outer space shots are beautiful, but nothing's happening. They last a very long time. The ape thing is interesting, but at the same time, you're like, there's no dialogue here, obviously. There's long portions of the movie with no dialogue. There's repeated shots, cutting back to Bowman in the pod, adjusting things. I mean, does that over and over again. Like, what effect did Kubrick want to aim for in having these long periods where there's really nothing happening?
By the way, did you see the film on a big screen or did you see it on a small screen?
I saw it on a small screen. To my regret, a local art theater was showing it on the big screen a couple of years ago, and I missed it. So I haven't seen it on the big screen.
No, the reason I asked that is that a lot of what's going on requires that big screen, and then you get the majesty of it and the grace of it, is visible on a big screen, and you try to watch it even on a bigger LCD or something. It's not going to transmit as well or translate as well. But by the way, James Randi, said that, his opinion was, with that second shot of the astronaut running in circles, the one that Kubrick trimmed, that Kubrick was trying to demonstrate how boring spaceflight would end up being, and that if that was his intention, he succeeded. I don't agree with that. I don't think that was the case. I think that they wanted to show a kind of visual majesty. It is true that, as Kubrick himself put it, this film puts the audience in the unaccustomed position of having to pay attention with their eyes. It was not a text-based film at all. It's a very avant-garde kind of art movie, actually. It happened to be a very big-budget art movie, which was critically, well, that's a mixed story, but which was commercially successful, and as a result, slayed the Western as the predominant Hollywood form and introduced the big-budget sci-fi epic spectacular film as the reigning paradigmatic Hollywood form. Kubrick did that with 2001, just something we could talk about. He also removed the text-first, text-forward reigning technique used by Hollywood for their big-budget films, which, by the way, had started with the talkie. Pre-sound in film, visual storytelling was what was done, and that was the only way to do it. You had intertitles, but basically you had to tell the story in image. And then with the talkie, with the introduction of sound, there was a lot of criticism that films suddenly became stage plays that had been filmed. And that was still sort of true, in '68. Although that kind of conveniently ignores a lot of European avant-garde films, French New Wave, and other films. But in general, there was still that expectation by people going to see Hollywood films that it would be there would be a lot of explanation. So nobody was ever, unclear what was going on. It was all spelled out, And one of the things that you'll notice if you examine works of art that are considered masterpieces in any medium, there's usually some mystery there. There's usually something unexplained there. There's usually something that keeps people thinking. The reason that they're masterpieces is there's something there that is unexplainable, inexplicable, So it was a kind of calculated risk by Kubrick to not explain the film too much, and I think he brought it off. Mm-hmm. I mean, why are we talking about it 50 years later, you see?
Yeah. You are very early on make a comparison that is obvious, and yet it's something I never thought of before I read it, which is that, the word Odyssey is in the title, and Homer's Odyssey is in its most basic form a kind of inspiration for this film. And you note that the main character is Dave Bowman, and Odysseus had a bow and arrow, which he used to slay the suitors to Penelope. Is that her name? You also, as you mentioned, Ulysses. There's another great work of art in the 20th century that was based on the Odyssey, and that's Joyce's Ulysses. The Odyssey is about returning home, and that made me think about the end of the movie, and that he does return. He goes as far out as possible, and yet at the very end he returns to Earth. What do you think about that theme of a cosmic return at the end of the film?
I think it was very conscious. They were studying Joseph Campbell. Joseph Campbell produced his, truly superb book studying the features common to human myths called The Hero with a Thousand Faces, which came out in the late 50s, early 60s. One of the things that Joseph Campbell, who Kubrick handed Clark a book at one point early on and said, read this is key. And Campbell broke down one of the dramaturgical structures common to all myths is separation, initiation, and return. The hero leaves his home, his or her, usually his home and his people, experiences a kind of initiation somewhere else, a magical realm, and then returns with new knowledge to his people. And that is common in the Odyssey. It's common in Eastern mythologies. It seems to be, baked into our genes somehow. And they were very conscious that, that structure when they designed 2001: A Space Odyssey. They had to, Bowman had to come back. That in Greek, in ancient Greek, that's called nostos, the homecoming. Nostalgia has the same etymological root, coming back to the home. So it was conscious, and I think it's one reason why even people who were irritated or exasperated by the opacity of that film came back, saw it again, discussed it, didn't just dismiss it, because because we are predisposed to to understand and appreciate that type of structure. And one last thing about that, George Lucas consciously used Campbell himself for Star Wars in a more cartoonish way, comic book way. But I'm absolutely sure he did that in part because he was aware that Kubrick had done that so successfully in 2001.
So let's talk about the film's kind of legacy. So Star Wars is one obvious kind of descendant of what Kubrick did. But there aren't a lot of films I can think of that had the same kind of epic scope and ambition, or were as difficult to make. Like I was thinking, what other film could, maybe Titanic was as difficult to make with sinking the set in water over and over again. What do you see as the film's legacy?
Well, as I said, the film vanquished the Western and introduced the Hollywood big budget science fiction spectacular as a paradigmatic form. So we've had one after the other. Every summer we get the Hollywood science fiction blockbusters. They're not necessarily, they're usually not even remotely comparable to 2001, but they do. That was the terrain that Kubrick prepared, that this can be a form that can succeed. And many films that followed, Close Encounters of the Third Kind, Star Wars, E.T., you name it, Alien, the Alien series, have done better than 2001, or, have been more commercially successful. That doesn't mean that they've been more successful aesthetically or as works of art. And one of the interesting things among these very competitive, directors of the 70s, 80s, 90s, and now, is that everybody's very interestingly and curiously humble when they discuss 2001, and they say, that was the masterpiece. So Ridley Scott is not known for his humility, and neither is James Cameron. But they acknowledge that Kubrick was the master and did this first and did it best. George Lucas has said, as far as he's concerned, that's the greatest science fiction movie, and Star Wars is only comparable technically or something, but it's not in its sweep. I'm paraphrasing, but you get the idea. And certainly Spielberg, tips his hat at Kubrick frequently. So it was
have you seen Ready Player One?
Not yet.
There's an extensive Kubrick homage in it.
Really?
Yes, but it's to The Shining, and I was thinking about it. It was almost as if it created what it would be like to play a video game version of The Shining. It's very strange, but you're in the sets are there with the carpet is there and the
interesting,
and the doors of the elevator open and the blood comes out, and then the characters are running away, and it's very wacky. But since Kubrick considers Spielberg kind of his heir, so I guess I was this is in some way. We could think it was smiled upon. At the other time, I was like, "This is just totally bizarre that they're sticking, a 10-minute Shining sequence into this crazy sci-fi movie."
By the way, I'm not sure Kubrick considered Spielberg his heir.
Oh, really?
They were friends, but that doesn't mean that he considered him his heir. And in fact, he made skeptical comments. He was on the record making skeptical comments about Schindler's List, saying this is not a film about the Holocaust. This is a film about winning something. Holocaust was not about winning, and so forth. They were friends. but I don't think he thought in that way. The director that Kubrick admired most, at least as of the early '60s, was Bergman. We're talking art film, art filmmakers, film directors. But I'm not surprised that there's that, homage to Kubrick, because certainly Spielberg acknowledges Kubrick's mastery and has. But there have been many examples, interestingly, of salutes to 2001 or Kubrick in subsequent films. I mean, so for example, in Charlie and the Chocolate Factory, you had a kind of the entire excerpt of the man apes dancing around the monolith. And if the monolith becomes a chocolate bar, which is a little bit too obvious as far as I'm concerned. And then, you have The Simpsons. You've got Homer throwing a felt tip marker like a highlighter up in the air and it becomes a spacecraft. The match cut, epic match cut. And there are a lot of others. Also Mad Men. You have all kinds of tributes in the Mad Men to 2001 specifically, including an episode called The Monolith.
Mm-hmm. So
it's clearly highly influential film on many levels, in design, in visual effects for sure, you name it. I mean, and as I said, just changing the reigning paradigmatic form of Hollywood.
Mm-hmm. I think we've got about an hour. I think we're near the end of our time. Is there anything else you want to say about Space Odyssey?
Well, no, I just hope that people will give it a chance. And I tried to write a narrative nonfiction book, one that really pulls people in because of the narrative threads. And interestingly enough, there was one comment that Kubrick himself made to Brian Aldiss when they were working on an early draft for the film that became something Spielberg directed, the one about the
AI.
No, not AI. It's another one, about the robot boy. Do you remember the name of that? It originated in Aldiss's story, Super Toys Last All Summer Long.
Okay.
And it was based on a Kubrick script, and Spielberg shot it. And the name doesn't, occur to me at this very moment, but it's easy to Google that. But in any case, what was my point about that? Yeah, so Kubrick said to Aldiss at one point when they were talking about technique, and he said, "When was the last time you saw a movie that had too many good short scenes?" And I thought, that's really interesting. That's a very good point. That's a great way to structure a book, too. Lots of good short scenes, So in a way, Kubrick, apart from the subject being 2001 and being Kubrick, that comment influenced how I structured the book.
Cool. Yeah. It's an epic, an epic retelling of creating an epic. Thank you so much, Michael, for coming on. Thank you to all of our listeners and viewers, and we'll see you again next time.
Thank you for having me on. Take care.